Welcome to the first part of an extended conversation with Professor Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian Nobel laureate economist and political philosopher. Professor Hayek's life spans a period of the 20th century in which the turmoil of enormous changes in our material lives has been matched by equally huge changes in the ideas of social scientists. His thoughts and writings have had an influence, especially recently, at least as great as any other economic philosopher. Professor Hayek is commonly called the father figure of the Austrian School of Economics. This school of thought takes as a starting point the assumption that the classically liberal value of freedom of the individual is not just a means to an end, but demands respect as a value on its own. Springing from this is the conviction that individuals, acting freely without guidance or coercion by the state, will create the best form of what Professor Hayek calls the social order. Much of Hayek's work has been devoted to explaining the consequences of attempting to create other social orders, either by deliberate planning or by other, more socialist interventions in the workings of the market. The story of his life is the story of a gradual refinement of ideas, an intellectual development along with his times. For example, he wrote The Road to Serfdom during the Second World War as an overtly political response to an intellectual consensus at that time in favor of planning. But his later works extend his critique of the idea of socialism, labeling it the fatal conceit. From there, he developed his view of the free liberal society with an analysis of the importance of inherited moral traditions and evolving institutions. Lately, he has turned to political philosophy, examining ways in which a society seeking liberty can prevent the encroachment of the state into the lives of individuals by locking the power of government behind the legal framework of a constitution of liberty. In an age of instant electronic media response, which tends to reflect centrist consensus views, it's very easy to forget that the ideas of intellectuals are powerful undercurrents, pulling the debating ground in one direction or another over a period of time as opinion formers influence each other. I believe that the ideas of Friedrich Hayek have had an enormous influence in clarifying and enriching the debate on how to maintain a free society. I'd like to begin with the city in which you were born, Vienna before the First World War, where there was a tremendous intellectual and artistic flowering with Freud and the logical positivists, for example. What were your own early intellectual interests?
You must distinguish between pre and after the war. I was 15 when the war broke out, 18 when I joined up and for a year fought the Italians, and only in 1918 then that I came back and started to take part in public life. But my childhood and early is very important because I come from a purely biological family tradition. I then changed. It was the excitement, the political excitement connected with the war and the big collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which shifted my interest from a purely natural science background interest to a political interest. And only at the very end that I decided to study law in order to specialize in economics. But it was the political excitement at the time which opened to me a new world. I had lived in the pure university and academic atmosphere. My family had been for generations, and my brothers and even my children became biologists. So I left the traditional thing and became a political scientist, one now calls it.
Now, the First World War was an event which had a remarkable impact on a whole generation of intellectuals. Would you say it had much influence on your later ideas?
The breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the whole problem faced by this was probably one of the causes which made me shift my interest from pure natural science to political problems. It meant observing the collapse of a society, and more especially the collapse of the intellectual society of Vienna. Vienna was, as you said, and remained for another decade, one of the great intellectual centers of the world. Nothing could be more exciting than Vienna of the 1920s and the early 30s, because I left as early as 1931. But the number of what were called Austrian or Viennese schools, which were active at the same time, the most famous, of course, is psychoanalysis, which never interested me much, but in law, in anthropology, in economics, in art, in everywhere there were world-famous Viennese schools, most of whose disciples are now spread all over the world. But Vienna was not only in this sense a great university, it had an exceptionally good public. I mean, you could speak to large audiences of highly civilized intellectuals, which I ought to say was a byproduct of a very peculiar situation. See, Vienna had a very large Jewish minority, who were not literally excluded, but whose chances in academic life were very small. They all became professionals of one sort, but they retained an intellectual interest, with the result that there was a large public to whom you could speak, I think, as great or as greater than any part of the world. And it was this audience you had which kept an intellectual life going in Vienna, which, if it was not dominated by this group of Jewish intellectuals, was conditioned by it. And that I mention this only because it explains why the position of Vienna as an intellectual center has so largely disappeared. It was the expansion of the Jewish community. In fact, I always say Vienna was then divided into three groups, and that is historically quite important. A purely non-Jewish group, which largely dominated the university. I don't think till I came to the university I knew a single Jew intimately. There were another type, a mixed society, in which I at once entered as I entered into the university, and a purely Jewish society. Now that was determined. It was a similar situation in two other Central European cities, Budapest and Prague. And they, of course, for the later Nazi occupation, were largely dispersed over the whole world, and that is the cause of the end of this great Viennese center.
Now, in what direction did the breakup of the empire and the great political turbulence of Vienna in the 20s push you? I mean, for example, the inflation was presumably a major factor in your ideas.
By that time, of course, I was a fairly competent economist when the inflation really expanded. Originally, it was that as every young intellectual attracted by socialism of a mad sort. I probably was, when I began my study, what in England they've called a Fabian kind of approach, and convinced that there must be an intelligent solution of the many dissatisfactory events of this world. And so it was as a mild socialist that I decided I must study economics. I was very soon cured of this belief that socialism was the solution, because I came after 3 years under the direct influence of Ludwig von Mises, who had then published his great book on socialism, demonstrating that the socialist solution was impossible in a technical sense. I think the most important thing I then did learn...
Could I just interrupt at that point? You say socialism is impossible in a technical sense. Now, what exactly do you mean by that?
It proposes a solution which is not the solution. You cannot... Well, it takes a long time, but it's my central problem. Socialism assumes that all the available knowledge can be used by a single central authority. It overlooks that the modern society, which I now prefer to call the extended order, which exceeds the perception of any individual mind, is based on the utilization of widely dispersed knowledge. And once you are aware that we can achieve that great utilization of available resources only because we utilize the knowledge of millions of men. It becomes clear that the assumption of socialism that the central authority can command all this knowledge is just not correct.
So what you're doing is you're turning on its head the common point one often hears from the left, that because the problems of modern society are so difficult, that they require planning. You're saying because they're so complex, they make planning impossible.
Well, I think the nicest form to put it is to say that socialism protesting against the production for profit and not for use objects to what makes the extended society possible. Production for use is only possible in a society where we know all the facts. But to achieve the situation where we are all working for people whom we do not know and are being supported by the work of people we do not know is made possible because we produce for profit. Profit is a signal which tells us what we must do in order to serve people whom we do not know.
Yes. Now, you and von Mises put forward this criticism in the 1920s. What reaction did you get from the socialists of the day? What reply did they make to that fundamental criticism?
They were unwilling to admit the factual argument. They preferred to withdraw on the fact. This is a difference of values on which science cannot decide. Once you accept the socialist values that we must be guided by a conception of just distribution, all the factual arguments are irrelevant. Well, of course, the factual arguments prove that the just distribution is impossible unless the distributor knows all the facts. So my answer is, if the factual assumptions of socialism were correct, it would be a moral duty to aim at the just distribution. But you have to recognize you cannot do it. In fact, you can produce enough to maintain the present population of the world only because of a spontaneous process or mechanism which enables you to make use of infinitely more information than any central authority possesses.
Now, I wonder if one couldn't make a criticism of some liberals, some classical liberals, of a different but related kind, and arising almost from your relationship with von Mises. Is it not the case that some liberals are so anxious to allow society to develop freely and spontaneously that they wish to remove virtually all habits, customs, all pre-existing inherited moral traditions? They want a very radical criticism of society. Now, you yourself wouldn't go along with that, I think it's fair to say.
Well, I don't know whether I wouldn't. I think it needs much more careful definition. Our basic problem is that we have three levels, I would say, of moral beliefs. We have, in the first instance, our intuitive moral feelings, which are adapted to the small person-to-person society, where we act for people whom we know and are served by people whom we know. Then we have a society governed by moral traditions, which, unlike what the modern rationalists believe, are not intellectual discoveries of men who designed them, but they're the result of a process which I now prefer to describe as the biological term of group selection. Those groups who had quite accidentally developed favorable habits, such as the tradition of private property and the family, who did succeed, but who never understood this. So we owe our present extended order of human cooperation very largely to a moral tradition which the intellectual does not approve of because it has never been intellectually designed. And it has to compete with a third level of moral beliefs, those which the morals which the intellectuals design in the hope that they can better satisfy man's instincts than the traditional rules do. And we live in a world where three moral traditions are in constant conflict. The innate ones, the traditional ones and the intellectually designed ones. And ultimately, all our political conflicts of this time can be reduced as affected by a conflict between three moral traditions of a different nature, not only of different content, one being innate and spontaneous, the other traditions we have learned, and the third, imagined designs of our intellect. I think you can explain the whole of the social conflicts of the last 200 years by the conflicts of the three moral traditions.
Now, I'd like to approach the question of the future society from a different standpoint. One of the principal criticisms that one gets of a liberal individualist society is that it is selfish, that it's not an altruistic society, whereas socialism, whatever flaws it has in terms of efficiency, is a society in which we all look after the weakest, the sick, the old, and so on. Now, what role do you see for altruism in a liberal individualist society?
See, altruism is an instinct we've inherited from the small society where we know for whom we work, whom we serve. When you pass from this, as I like to call it, concrete society where we are guided by what we see, to the abstract society which far transcends our range of vision, it becomes necessary that we are guided not by the knowledge of the effect of what we do, but with some abstract symbols. Now, this only symbol which takes us where we can make, tells us where we can make the best contribution is profit. And in fact, by pursuing profit, we are as altruistic as we can possibly be, because we extend our concern to people who are beyond our range of personal conception. This is a condition which makes it possible even to produce what I call an extended order, an order which is not determined by our aim, by our knowing what are the most urgent needs, but by an impersonal mechanism who, by a system of communication, puts a label on certain things which is wholly impersonal. Now, it's exactly this where the conflict between the traditional moral, which is not altruistic, which emphasizes private property, and the instinctive moral, which is altruistic, come in constant conflict. The very tradition from a concrete society where each serves the needs of other people whom he knows, to an extended abstract society where most people serve the needs of others whom they do not know, whose existence they are not even aware, was only made possible by the abandonment of altruism and solidarity as the main guiding factors, which I admit are still the factors dominating our instincts. And what restrains our instincts in this respect is the tradition of private property and the family, the two traditional rules of morals, which are in conflict with instinct.
Well, I then have to ask you in specific terms, how would a liberal individualist society deal with such cases as, let us say, a steel worker who's living in a town which is entirely dependent on a steel factory which now closes? How would it deal with somebody suffering from a chronic illness who was incapable, or a mental illness, an even better case in a sense? How would it deal with those two cases?
Well, I must begin what you mean. What do you mean by how does society deal with? So far as provision of individuals for any collapse of the earning capacity, of course the answer is insurance. We have developed insurance, and need not be social insurance. Any earning person can provide against such elements. We have stopped the development of competitive insurance by bringing in social insurance. But in America, of course, even before social insurance was general, this development had already gone very far.
But obviously, if people do not insure themselves against something like losing a job, and they then find themselves without any welfare assistance to be able to turn to.
Oh, that I would return to the old poor law. I think a minimum of that kind, every society. I think the main emphasis would be had to be local provision, not on a national scale. What the poor law did on the local scale in the past. But I haven't finished my story. You see, individual catastrophes to be dealt with this. I don't think there is anything society, in inverted commas, can do against the collapse of a firm, except the increase mobility of labor, largely by repressing the trade unions' resistance. See, if the steel industry declines, and this manifests itself in the collapse of two great steel industries, the only hope for these workers is to get employment in their own job, a reduction of wages. You must have flexible wages. I think the idea that a steel worker, in the time in which the steel industry was prosperous, has achieved a level of wages to which he now has a moral right, is incompatible with a free society. The idea that you are entitled to the wages to which you've become used, if systematically pursued, must lead to the complete destruction of the competitive market. People must recognize that even as workers, they are exposed to the risk, the same risk which every professional man is exposed to, of losing the opportunity to maintain his present standard and having to descend to a lower standard.
But this leads me to the attractions of socialism, because quite plainly, socialism would be a very attractive option for someone faced with those circumstances, because it would protect them.
I do question.
Well, what are the other...
These people are in themselves a minority.
Yes, but
that the majority believes that this sort can really provide security for all is an intellectual error. It cannot. And all you can do is to try to make people understand that as a general benefit, it is something which cannot be achieved.
But it seems to me, just listening to you on that point, that first of all, socialism would be attractive both to the steel worker who was losing his job out of self-interest, but also to the mass of society who, through the television, through newspapers, would come to feel a certain sympathy with people in this situation, or indeed even more so, sympathy with someone whose difficulties stem from illness. So doesn't socialism appeal to both self-interest and altruism, and in a way that your liberal individualist society somehow fails to do?
Except that if people knew how great the costs were of achieving this ideal in blocking further improvement or even our capacity to abolish extreme poverty in other parts of the world, they would say they have to bring that sacrifice in order to keep the machinery in existence on which the preservation of the present level of wealth in the world depends. That assumes a degree of intellectual understanding which may be unachievable. We may say, and I am inclined to occasionally to argue this myself, man is not yet intelligent enough to understand which sacrifices are required to preserve his present level of civilization.
I think you'll agree that Professor Hayek's views are extraordinarily stimulating. To recap on the main points. Firstly, he believes that planning a model society is technically impossible, because the knowledge available to a central authority is inevitably limited. Individual planners cannot possibly know all the facts about what Hayek calls the extended order, in economic terms, the market economy. Secondly, he believes that well-meaning altruism is an instinct we have inherited from the days of small communities where we knew and could see most of what affected us. Nonetheless, the extended order, in which we don't know everything, does require the traditions of private property and other moral traditions like the family and religion to sustain it. Lastly, he identifies a third level of beliefs, and that's the morals which we invent in the hope of improving on inherited traditions. It is the clash between these three types of beliefs which he says explain social conflicts. Welcome to the second part of an extended conversation with Professor Friedrich Hayek, the Nobel laureate economist and political philosopher. Professor Hayek is sometimes called the father figure of the Austrian School of Economics, whose foundation stones are an implicit belief in the value of individual freedom and a scientific understanding of the benefits of the free market economy. In the first part of our discussion, we trace Professor Hayek's early academic development in the intellectual hothouse of Vienna in the 1920s, when he studied under the economic philosopher von Mises. From this period grew an understanding that planned socialism is technically impossible, because planners are inevitably limited in their knowledge of all the forces that affect us. According to Professor Hayek, there is a mechanism available in markets and prices, which spontaneously create what he calls an extended order, a society capable of creating enough wealth to support a large population by making use of infinitely more information than a central authority can possibly possess. It was with this well-rehearsed scientific understanding of the value of freedom and free markets that Professor Hayek arrived in Britain in 1929, taking up a professorship at the London School of Economics in 1931. This was the time of the Great Depression on both sides of the Atlantic, when all the old ideas seemed to have collapsed in a sea of wretched unemployment. This was the problem which delineated the intellectual debating ground throughout the 1930s. As Professor Hayek was defined, the debate came to be dominated by the ideas of one man, John Maynard Keynes, at that period the doyen of London's Bloomsbury elite and economics professor at King's College, Cambridge. The London School of Economics was itself moved to Cambridge at the outbreak of war in 1939. So here began a fascinating period in history when Friedrich Hayek, the upholder of the classical liberal ideas of freedom and free markets, met a new breed of economic philosophers, dedicated to solving the problems of the age by government intervention and later redistribution of income in the name of equality and social justice. I'd like to start with your arrival in Britain. What were your impressions initially of English society of the 30s?
Well, I was long continued to be deceived that 19th century Britain still continued. See, I was very much aware that the kind of liberalism which I had grown up in my Vienna circle was Gladstonian liberalism. And I deceived myself for quite a long time coming back to England that at least the older generation still adhered to Gladstonian liberalism. But I only gradually discovered that the political trend in England had led almost further away from Gladstonian liberalism than it had on the continent. So in the kind of class in which I moved, it so happened that they were still largely Gladstonian liberals. But I taught at the London School of Economics, where I found the extreme opposite represented a very strong character. So my long existing opposition to socialism was provoked much more by sitting in the same common room with people like Harold Lasker and so on than it had been even in Austria. And that drove me on more and more to analyze the intellectual development which led up to this. I mean, the contrast between the England I found and the England which I had expected and at first still thought I discovered here. I mean, arriving in England, I said, oh, at last, this is the atmosphere which I'd always wanted. And then I discovered that it was an atmosphere confined to an ever-shrinking, diminishing part of the population, that in particular the intellectuals were predominantly on the left, which was even more confirmed when in 1939 the London School of Economics moved to Cambridge. I came to a group of Cambridge scientists where, as I formulated one time, I found that all the most intelligent people were socialists.
But of course this was a Britain suffering from a major slump. What are your own retrospective reflections on the slump in the 30s, on economic policy and the behavioural success or failure of the national government?
Well, it has to go back further, you know. The great misfortune, I think, was the attempt to return to gold at the old parity in the 1920s, which in a sense was quite unnecessary. Because as I was pointing out at the time, when I came to England, but too late, David Ricardo had argued 100 years before that he would never advise the government to restore a currency depreciated by 30% to its former par. If a single English economist had recalled this and quoted it, the fight against the return at the former parity might have been won. But Keynes used the opportunity to protest against the return to gold in any form. So unfortunately, it was done in a return at the former parity. And Keynes was convinced by that stage, perhaps as a fact correctly, that with the strength British trade unions had achieved, you could no longer hope to maintain aggregate demand at a constant value of money, and he hoped that by a gradual and slow decrease of the value of money, you could overcome the resistance of rigid wages. Well, that was the situation I found, and which led me in a conflict with Keynes, and most of my years in England, I can't say, the first 10 years. From then, the situation became even more peculiar. Keynes became largely responsible for British monetary policy, but at the same time...
This is during the war?
It's during the war,
yes.
But at the same time, he was the one who would resist inflation at the time. And so, having been criticizing Keynes during the 30s, I refrained from doing so because I wanted him to keep in power, because the alternative would have been even worse.
But why do you think that the general theory, which came out in 36, and with which you disagreed and many other economists, why did it have such enormous influence?
Well, I wish I knew. I was puzzled by the time. In fact, I did not believe it would succeed, so much so that while I had spent a year analyzing in great detail his earlier books, the Treatise on Money, and then only to hear from him by the time the second part of my criticism was published, I no longer believe in all that. And I didn't want to invest more effort in criticizing the general theory, whose success is still a puzzle to me, because it reverted to a very primitive idea which had been clearly refuted in the 19th century, that there's a single relation between the aggregate demand for final products and employment. So much so that Leslie Stephen in the 1880s had pointed out the test of a good economist is that he does not make that particular mistake. Well, Keynes revived it and gave a plausible explanation. And I should add, he did not succeed while he lived. But when he died, he was suddenly raised to sainthood.
But Keynes might not have approved of the Keynesianism which came to dominate policy.
I'm sure he wouldn't. In fact, I can positively say so. The very last time I saw him, about 6 weeks before his death, I was meeting him. I was still having dining rights at King's College, and I was here for a weekend, and talked to him after dinner and asked him whether he wasn't alarmed by what his pupils, naming two, I won't name now, were doing, agitating for more expansion, while in fact the danger clearly was inflation. He completely agreed with me and assured me my theory was frightfully important in the 1930s with the question of combating deflation. Trust me, if inflation ever becomes a danger, I'm going to turn public opinion around like this. 6 weeks he was later he was dead and couldn't do it. I think he would have been fighting the inflationary policy.
Before we get on to the post-war world, I would just like to ask you about the 30s in another aspect. Were you at all closely following the international developments, the rise of Hitler and Mussolini at Munich and the clash between the dictatorships and the democracies?
Inevitably, yes.
And I was thinking that perhaps it was during this period that you were germinating the idea for the road to serfdom. To what extent did Nazism directly influence that book?
Yes, very much so. I mean, the similarity between the various forms of totalitarianism became very obvious to me. At the same time, when I became so very much aware that certain ideas of engineers and natural scientists who interpreted the world too simply were really the intellectual source of the belief that we can direct all the activity in the service of social justice. I happened to, just at the time immediately before and early in the war, do a study of the intellectual origin of socialism, and discovered in this that already the early French socialists were essentially totalitarians, that Hitler no less than Lenin or Marx even drew on what was in its consequences a totalitarian conception of government, improved only by the idea that we are going to do it in the service of some idea of social justice, but that they would be bound to use the same compulsory methods, essentially restricting and diminishing individual freedom, always in the service of a very good purpose, of course, not in the service of a particular group, but that basically there was no difference between socialism and fascism.
But isn't it fair to say that in Britain over the last 30 years that we have gone a considerable way down the direction of increasing state control over industry, over planning, over education, over the provision of welfare and so on, and yet people in this country don't feel any less free?
Oh, they are not much less free because they've never been consistently moving in that direction. See, when at the end of the war I published the book, The Road to Serfdom, I did never say, as is alleged, and I say once you start on this track, you are bound to go along to the bitter end. But just a warning that if you tried consistently to follow the principles on which it is based, then it would lead to totalitarianism.
But in fact, there were a number of intellectuals, I think Keynes was one, who argued that you could risk doing what I think he called dangerous acts if the community had strong moral traditions which would inhibit them from oppressing the people.
I didn't deny it even at the time. But I'm afraid moral traditions are made by history. If you move in a certain direction, moral traditions change, and this confidence as the moral tradition of the English was so fundamentally different from those on the continent, rather exaggerated the position. The English were not immune, but they were up to a point protected against moving too fast and too far in the dangerous direction. But I think this confidence that, which incidentally Churchill overheard. I had one single conversation in my life with Churchill, who had by that time been acquainted with my book, and he said it was very instructive, but it would never happen in England. That was his absolute confidence. Again, trusting what was presumed to be a peculiarly strong, I suppose, individualism or adherence to a moral respect for the individual, which I'm still not convinced the English really have. They've been warned by what they've seen to happen elsewhere and have become cautious. but I don't think the tone occasionally used by socialist politicians are very reassuring, really.
The road to serfdom certainly altered your own life. I mean, from an economist who was known to a small circle, you became suddenly a notorious political figure and almost a figure in the 1945 general election. It was even a bigger success, I think, in America.
Well, yes, but a very different kind. You see, the English had been aware of these problems. You could accuse me of having exaggerated an argument, but it was not a wholly new conception. Some of the more reflective people, well, the fact that Orwell, of course, was arguing at the same time, and I no longer believe, as I did believe at one time, that he was directly inspired by my Road to Serfdom. He had written a review of that book, and I thought that had started him, but it's now clear that by that time he already had the draft of Animal Farm ready. So he must have arrived at this general view independently of anything he learned from him. He was not the only one. So this was not a completely new idea. It was an idea to which the English public was somewhat prepared. The Americans had only been in the last 10 years become converted to a sort of socialism. It was only the New Deal. And it was the latest exciting discovery of all the intellectuals. And I was directing my argument against what all the intellectuals thought was a great achievement of the last generation. So the result in America was that both sides talked about my book. Nobody really read it or studied it. In fact, I remember vividly a letter from one great American philosopher to an English philosopher who blamed the English philosopher having merely quoted my book, this dreadful book, which I, of course, have not read.
You went to America, in fact, about this time. In
1950 only.
1950. And remained there for almost 20 years at
12
Chicago.
years, yes.
Your book, The Constitution of Liberty, is dedicated to the new civilization that is growing in America.
Yeah.
And I wondered about your impressions. Was American society something like the Great Society, the nearest approach to the Great Society that you, in a sense, an advocate, an explorer of, a complex society relying on general rules and allowing people within those rules to develop their own interests and activities?
Well, all I had in mind with that remark is that the Americans were evidently very flexible in their moral approaches and were capable of adjusting their moral views to wholly new problems, while in Europe, and particularly in Great Britain, tradition was so strong that we could not readily expect the formation of a new moral approach. I was quite certain, I'm even more certain now, that the moral views of the next 100 or 200 years are going to be determined by the United States more than any.
Yet America is a very religious society, much more so in a sense than Europe. And I wonder whether or not it isn't the persistence of strong religious feeling in America that makes it possible to have a moral justification both for hard work and effort and enterprise, the Protestant ethic.
You were raising a very big problem if I started talking on the whole question of the role of religion. See, I better admit to begin with that I am myself an agnostic. I mean, not really surprising, being the son and grandson of Darwinian zoologists. It's almost inevitable. I should add that formally I've remained within the Roman Church. I've never formally left it. But in the book I'm now producing, one of the main arguments is that we owe civilization to religion, because we owe it to a moral tradition which we cannot rationally justify and which maintained itself only because it was supported by supernatural beliefs. I recently had on this subject a very interesting controversy with one of the most intelligent cardinals of the Roman Church, whom I bitterly offended in a discussion to say we owe our civilization to superstition. And then I apologized and said, well, superstition surely is too hard a word. let's call it symbolic truth. And he completely agreed with me. We were suddenly on the same line. Once he admitted that the truth of religion is something different from the truth of science. And I admitted that our civilization is a product of beliefs our intellect could not justify. We were really talking in the same way and completely agreeing.
Well, I want to explore for a while one aspect of this, and that is the second book of your trilogy, The Mirage of Social Justice, attacks the idea of social justice as, in a sense, a nonsense. You attack both the word social and the word justice in this context. Social you describe as, in a sense, a word that merely means not in front of any phrase, and justice you say is inapplicable to the sort of society in which people are free. Perhaps you'd like to expand on that.
Well,
last point.
justice undoubtedly is an attribute of individual human action, something which ought to guide what the individual does. Now, nothing which the individual can do can secure an order of wealth or distribution of wealth which corresponds to our wish to see people reviewed justly or according to a reward appropriate to their improvement. The whole nature of the market system presupposes that people are rewarded for success and not for intentions.
Now, I have to then say, let us take a society in which nurses are paid much less than striptease dancers. I wonder if that society will accept that situation indefinitely or permanently, because people will tend to feel that it is immoral, unjust in some sense.
But you see, you have here now the conflict between the different kinds of moral traditions which I spoke. It is certainly objectionable to our instincts. I dislike it. And yet I'm convinced that if we are to maintain a society which makes use of much more information than any individual has, we have to put up to it. But we are up against this very strong and in a sense justified resistance of our instincts. And that's our whole problem. A society which is efficient cannot be just. And unfortunately, a society which is not efficient cannot maintain the present population of the world. So I think our instincts will have to learn. We shall perhaps for generations still be fighting the problem and fluctuating from the one position to another. I know exactly why the majority of people do not like the kind of relative status which a free competitive society produces. But every time they try to correct this, they start on a course where to apply the same principle universally destroys the whole system. And I think for perhaps the next 200 years, we'll be fluctuating from the one direction to the other, trying to satisfy our feeling of justice and leading away from efficiency, getting to finding out that in trying to cure poverty, we really increase poverty, then returning to the other system, a more effective system to abolish poverty, but on a more unjust principle. And how long it will have to last before we learn to discipline our feelings, I can't predict. But let me add to this. I am personally convinced that what we call our moral tradition is altogether a discipline on our instincts. And we may have to learn a further discipline on our instincts, which will force us to suppress the feeling that certain differences of reward are unjust. And we'll have to recognize that only a system where we tolerate grossly unjust differences of reward is capable of keeping the present population of the world in existence.
Well, I would have thought that the Puritan ethic, which identified worldly success with hard work, and which still exists in America much more than it does in Europe, might be one of the reasons for the continued energy and success of the American economy.
Yes, of course, but even that Puritan ethics has an element in it which is not quite compatible, because it assumes that hard work must bring its proper reward. I think we have to reconcile our facts that even hard work is not a guarantee, that success must be, up to a point, a matter of accident.
Nonetheless, it is a myth which serves to justify the system.
Yes. It's one of the, the conceits with which I spoke before, of the way in which religion has made things plausible which people otherwise would not have accepted.
Professor Hayek's involvement at the heart of the debate on the theories of Keynes gave him an insight into the development of Keynesian policies which followed Keynes's death. Once again, he is preoccupied with the consequences of attempting to direct the workings of society through government controls and the damage that this might do to individual freedom. In particular, the attempt to impose ideals of social justice upon a free society will, he says, inevitably make the market economy less efficient. According to Hayek, the inequalities which a free, competitive society produces are something which we have to accept. We have to overcome our instinct that something is unjust in order to retain our economic freedom. Welcome to the last part of an extended conversation with Professor Friedrich Hayek, the Nobel laureate economist and political philosopher. So far, we've explored the origins of Professor Hayek's ideas in the intellectual climate of Austria in the 1920s, and the development of his critique of centrally planned socialism as technically impossible. The 1930s and the 1940s saw a battle with Keynes and later his Keynesian followers, who believed that government had a role to direct the workings of a free society. In particular, the 1960s saw the emergence of attempts by government to create a more equal and just society. Hayek's response throughout this period was an onslaught on the dangers of collectively enforcing social justice and continual warnings that government intervention in the economy would lead to runaway inflation. I think it's fair to say, however, that during the affluent years of post-war growth, Hayek's voice was drowned by the strident cries of social commitment and Keynesian economics. But most people would agree that there was a watershed in political thought around the mid-1970s. Larger and larger doses of inflation, without any significant fall in unemployment, appear to be the only outcome available from repeated applications of orthodox Keynesian economic stimulus. It's at this point that the ideas of free market economists like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek were in the ascendant. The end of the 1970s saw conservatives like Mrs. Thatcher in Britain and Ronald Reagan in America come to power. The influence of ideas had, in a sense, come full circle. Economists everywhere began to reassess the market economy and tie in the technical analysis of its workings with the philosophical and political values of freedom. Freedom to set product prices, freedom to alter wages, freedom to spend one's own income, and freedom to act without the control of the state or state-protected vested interests. This is the central debate which continues in both Britain and America today. As you can imagine, Friedrich Hayek's life and work are crucial to it. Today, we've arrived at a period where the consequences of interfering with the workings of free markets are being questioned, just as Professor Hayek has been questioning for 50 years. Professor Hayek, I'd like to come up to the present and discuss the fact that after 20 years in which Keynesianism dominated economic policy and discussion, you received a Nobel Prize, just, I think, at the time when Keynesianism was going out of fashion. It had almost a symbolic significance as well as a personal one. Did you, to begin with, predict the course of Keynesianism and the inflationary collapse which it engendered.
Oh, I was quite certain. On the other hand, I never expected to receive a Nobel Prize at that time. That came as entire, because I did not think that Keynes had already lost its reputation in the intellectual and professional circles. I'm not certain that this was the real cause. I mean, the Swedes seem to have, the Nobel Committee seems to have been very anxious to keep a certain balance between different views, and therefore selected that rather peculiar pair, of which I was one. But that the Keynesian experiment would collapse, I've expected it sooner. I knew beforehand that the apparent success of Keynesianism depended on accelerating inflation, and I was certain that you could not indefinitely accelerate inflation. I had expected that the point at which everybody agreed you could not further increase it would come very much sooner. It had not to be accelerated as fast as I expected. In consequence, it could be carried longer as I expected. And by the time it fell into general discredit, it was much later than I should have foreseen. Then, of course, it went extraordinarily rapidly.
Yes, your criticism of it and that of Milton Friedman are often combined in the public mind, but I think it's fair to say that you don't entirely agree with his analysis of
No,
inflation.
very far from it. To see, in one respect, Milton Friedman is still a Keynesian, not on monetary theory, but on methodology. Keynes, very much against his own intentions, decided for a victory of what's called macroeconomics. And it still dominates the economic theory, and Milton Friedman is one of the apostles of macroeconomics, which has the effect that while we completely agree on general economic policy, we wholly disagree on monetary policy, because his theory is based on supposed regularities between statistical magnitudes. He is convinced, and he believes he has historically demonstrated, that there's a simple relationship between the total quantity of money and the price level. Well, one of my main difficulties is that nobody knows what the total quantity of money is. Money has so many different meanings. I have long been aware it's untrue. In fact, it's now 50 years that I once said, in effect, that one of the greatest misfortunes could happen in the field of economics if people ever cease to believe in the quantity theory of money, except that should ever come to take it literally.
In fact, you're really arguing that monetarism is an example of the more general error of thinking that you can know too much, you can know all of the facts of some economic problem.
Well, yes, you can put it this way, that the aggregates or sums, averages, which statistics offer you are no substitute for the detailed knowledge of every single price and their relations to each other, which really guide economic activity. That's a mistaken attempt to overcome our limited knowledge.
But there doesn't seem to be any great difference between you on policy.
No, well, if you look, forget about money for the moment, we completely agree. We agree in free markets. We may not entirely agree which form of monetary system is most favorable to an efficient market operation of the market.
Because you would prefer to have competing money, so that...
I'm absolutely convinced that no government is capable of, politically or intellectually, of providing exactly the amount of money which is needed for smooth economic development. And I should be all in favor. In fact, I'm convinced that we shall never have decent money again before we take from government the monopoly of issuing money and allow competing institutions, of course under different names, not issue the same money, but competing monies, and let people decide which kind of money they prefer to use.
Of course, they already can do this for all sorts of purposes. For example, if I decided to ask my employer to pay me in Deutschmarks, I suppose I might be able to persuade him, or I could agree to sell my house in terms of gold rather than in terms of pound sterling.
Well, very lately it has become legally possible in England, but only quite recently. And for the time being, for most purposes, you have practically no choice but to use the established currency. I think that has to change, and I doubt even whether present governments would not effectively suppress at once any development in that direction. They are very keen on preserving their monopoly because, of course, their ability to pursue something like monetary policy depends on this monopoly. Abolishing the government monopoly of the issuing of money would deprive governments of the possibility of pursuing monetary policy. That's what I want to say.
Yes.
But most people believe monetary policy is an essential tool of government.
When Margaret Thatcher came into office, I think you said at the time that she wouldn't be able to get down the rate of inflation by a gradualist approach, by gradually squeezing the money supply. She would only have the opportunity to do so by a short, sharp shock. I think your argument was that it's easier politically to withstand 6 million unemployed for 6 months than 3 million unemployed for 5 years. Now, that has turned out not to be correct, or would you accept that?
I'm not sure yet. I mean, she is still facing the problem of having high unemployment for so long a period. I think if she had been more drastic at the time, we would already be in the beginning of an upward swing in employment, and whether she may not still break over the problem of too large unemployment over too long a period, I'm by no means sure. I'm not claiming that it would have been politically possible for her to do what I wanted her to do. In fact, she claimed that she could have done it more quickly. But the fact that opinion now seems to settle down, it stabilizes what they call a moderate rate of inflation, rather alarms me, because we will again find out that no constant rate of inflation can affect as a stimulus. If you want to reduce unemployment by monetary means, you have to increase inflation again. And once you start on this, you're back in the old way. So I'm still very anxious to get down to zero inflation as fast as possible. And I would be quite hopeful that, I must qualify this. I've always emphasized that two things must happen at the same time. Stop inflation and make wages flexible. And so long as wages are kept as rigid, and I mean by this not so much the average wage level, but the wage structure, relative wages, the temptation to overcome that block which fixed wages constitute by just a little more inflation needs somebody as strong as Mrs. Thatcher to resist it, and I'm not sure how long she can persuade her cabinet.
Because one of the arguments you've been advancing in the last few years is that you will never be able to defeat inflation until you tackle the trade unions, which I think is the argument behind the rigidities of wages. Mm-hmm. And you take the view that more needs to be done?
Oh, I'm quite sure, yes. That particular and effective prevention of all use of violence by pickets must be carried through in all strictness. So long as there are possibilities of workers prevent other workers from working, I think we still have an intolerable position, which is not compatible with an operating market system.
Does your liberal individualist society have any role for trade unions? And if so, what is it?
Well, no doubt, if I were owner of an enterprise and trade unions had not been invented, I would invent them. I would have somebody to talk to on behalf of the workers, but I would not tolerate them taking any exclusive monopolistic control. So far, collective contracts for the people who want to accept them are all in favor. But of course, the whole problem is that the trade unions, particularly in this country more than elsewhere, in the course of time were granted privileges which the ordinary citizens has not. Essentially, various uses of force and violence in order to prevent other people from working with the terms that they work. And I am convinced that in a functioning market order, trade unions must have no monopolistic power of any kind.
So you would outlaw the closed shop. You would presumably also insist that trade unions must be answerable at law for any actions they undertake, like other citizens. And the underlying principle here, I suppose you're saying that people have a right to undercut other people's wages. That is a human right like any other.
I'm sure they have. I don't see how you can possibly morally justify it. See, it is not realized to what extent present trade union powers leads to an exploitation of a large part of the workers by the others. And one of the most extreme forms of it is that by driving up the wages of a particular group far above that of others, these groups attract most of the available capital, because the more expensive labor becomes, the more it's worthwhile to replace labor by capital. With the result that capital is attracted to those industries where wages have been driven up fastest at the expense of the others. The mass of the workers can't get better equipped and therefore cannot be made more efficient by investment, because the investment goes all to where wages are highest already.
So you're saying that trade unions cause unemployment?
I'm sure that not only unemployment, they keep the wages of a large part of labor low.
Why then do they continue to be so widely supported? I think in Britain, for example...
They just don't understand it. I mean, the things are evidently too difficult to understand. It's a naive idea that you can, by fixing wages, drive up the wages of all workers, still prevails, although it should be obvious to any intelligent person that any wage above a competitive level must mean that some people earn more at the expense of others who don't get employment at all.
But I noticed that, for example, recently in America, some defenders of unions have argued that by increasing wages, they compel companies to be more efficient than they would otherwise be. In other words, that they are themselves part of the cold blast of competition.
But see, that's exactly what I've been saying before in different form. Yes, it is true that where wages are pushed up most highly, the firms are compelled to invest much more than they otherwise would, and therefore to adopt technically more advanced things. But that happens at the expense of labor elsewhere. Capital which ought to go to the industries where the labor is least well equipped by capital is diverted to the industries where labor is already equipped with a great deal of capital, where wages in consequence of that are pushed still higher, while the workers who need assistance from capital most urgently, in those which are still little mechanized, are deprived of that capital.
But I wonder if there isn't a change coming up. For example, in the United States recently, labor unions have agreed contracts which actually reduced their wages and benefits under the impact of recession. And in Great Britain, again under the impact of recession, the labor unions, trade unions, have been prepared to abandon restrictive practices, which in many cases had been there for 30, 40 or 50 years.
Well, they are beginning to see it, but I don't think you can really compare the two countries. In the United States, the I have said, and I think it's still true, the unions are really a capitalist racket. Fully accepting the capitalist system and just trying, on the imitation of capitalist monopolies, to get a local gain by enforcing a local monopoly. They have not inspired by any legal, any labor theory, any ideology. The English are still much too much tied up with an idea of changing the order of society altogether. American trade unionists knows that he's dependent on competition, just wants to protect himself, but he knows he lives in a competitive society. The typical English trade unionist has a contempt for competition. He thinks competition is something unfair and unsocial. And this attitude is, as far as I can judge, still very strong. I think in England it is a question of converting the workers to admit their market order as a principle.
Again, I come back to an earlier point we discussed, which is how to identify those rules which are continuing to play a useful social role and those which, in a sense, need to be discarded. What do you have any, well, no simple test, obviously, but do you have any guidance as to which of our traditions we can happily throw overboard and those which we must continue to adhere to?
I don't think we can really rationally decide except by experiment. That's the reason why we must rely on tradition in the first instance and allow people to experiment with particular items, and which may lead to success of some groups because they have made some moral change, but it still must be decided by selection of a kind, by those groups succeeding who made appropriate changes, as it has been in the past. It were those countries of Europe which became commercial which succeeded. It is the United States which, because it became commercial in the wider sense, it succeeded. And what will succeed have to be decided by success of particular groups, which incidentally is one of the reasons why I'm so apprehensive about central determination of all this.
Could I just raise a very elementary objection to your argument, and that is cultural evolution seems to me to come up against one basic point, namely that a primitive but militarily effective society might very well overwhelm one which is, by most standards, superior, but which nonetheless is in some sense decadent.
Yes, it might happen, but in fact history shows that very largely, even if it was temporarily overwhelmed, the basic local tradition survived and re-emerged.
I have in mind, obviously, the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe.
Yes, well, we don't know how that will end. My most interesting example is where we have the longest history, the case of China, where it seems that temporarily strong government stopped further cultural evolution and led to temporary decline. And only when government became weak again, cultural evolution resumed. And that there, remainders of the old tradition always remained, even in existence over a long period, to re-emerge at a later stage, although the very efficient, strong government caused long periods of stagnation.
Among the many positions that you now have, you are one of 3 honorary fellows at the Hoover Institution in California, the other 2 being President Reagan and Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
Exactly.
I imagine you've often been asked about President Reagan. I'm going to ask you about Solzhenitsyn. He takes rather a gloomy view, it seems to me, of Western society, and I wonder whether or not you feel that he is someone who would be sympathetic to your vision of the great society.
He's a very complex figure. I don't know him at all well. I made his acquaintance because he received his Nobel Prize the same time as I did. He had been awarded 2 years before, but it was only then. And at that time, both his English and his German was rather limited, so we had only little conversation. But I have recently taken the opportunity of a Russian translation of the Road to Serfdom appearing to send him a copy. And evidently he saw the book for the first time. And he wrote me a letter that he could hardly believe that somebody who had not lived in Russia could see the effects of socialism as clearly as I had seen them. So it seems that from that point of view we are in agreement, although, of course, he seems to be a profoundly religious person, and what disturbs him about so I altogether from the letter about the West generally is such an irreligious society. I don't think he's happy in the West.
Well, he seems to be a pessimist. I must ask you, finally, are you now an optimist about the vision of your society coming about?
I'm more optimistic than I used to be, because there clearly is a revival of a belief in a free society amongst the young. I mean, compared with what the situation was 30 years ago, there's a very large number of highly intelligent people in their 20s and 30s who really believe in the kind of society in which I believe. The formula I regularly use when I'm asked this question, I've been doing this for 10 years, and I used to say, if in the next 20 years the politicians don't destroy the world, I think there's a good hope because a new generation is coming up. I'm now prepared to cut it down the next 10 years because I'm saying this for 20 years. So in a sense, I am optimistic.
You are optimistic. Thank you very much indeed. It would be surprising if Professor Hayek did not have strong views on inflation and unemployment, two of the major preoccupations of our age. Professor Hayek's view is, of course, that of the microeconomist. His paradoxical criticism of Milton Friedman as methodologically a Keynesian is based on Friedman's macroeconomic approach to monetarism. Once again, for Hayek, we cannot have enough knowledge of constantly changing prices in the marketplace to plan any effective policy. His solution instead is to allow currencies to compete, so that by deciding which kind of money they prefer, consumers will make it in the self-interest of those issuing the money to avoid inflation. In a similar microeconomic approach, the distorting effect of trade unions in the marketplace for labour is another of Hayek's main concerns. Trade unions exercising monopoly powers not only create unemployment, but by attracting capital into the higher wage industries, keep the wages of other workers low.